spectacle. This transformed the Bengali Palace screen device into urban monument. It does create a political vision, unlike the fortified Bengal capitals. However, relies less on defense and more on geometry, order, and visibility. Projects authority through rational organization rather than massive walls. The city became an imperial diagram of the enlightened national role. Question B. The British arrived in India as merchants in 1600, and over the following 3 centuries gradually expanded their political and military power. Describe how they established and consolidated colonial strongholds in Calcutta. Reference 2 key buildings or sites. In your answer, explain why these buildings, spaces were designed as they were, what architectural language did they draw on, and what were they intended to communicate. So yes, that's again a mouthful. So you've got, with this a chronological order, I would take photos of it. The British arrived as merchants through the British East India Company, which he's pointing out was chartered in 1600 here. They'd been around slightly before that. The Battle of Plassey in 1757 secured British dominance in Bengal. The East India Company gained tax collecting rights in 1765 and became a territorial ruler. Calcutta, on the navigable Hooley River, which is a deep channel for ocean-going ships, became the administrative and military capital. The city was organized around river commerce, military fortifications, and segregated European and Indian quarters. The buildings sites that are kind of important that you could reference, and I personally would be Fort William, which was built in 1702 and later rebuilt, anchored the British military and political control, contained the governor's residence, warehouses, and barracks. It was surrounded by an open space that functioned as a security buffer and symbol of social hygiene. It was a European-style military architecture, similar to the fortress cities of Narbonne in France. And it communicates racial and spatial separations. And you're kind of seeing that in this slide. And you're getting a little bit of the layouts for how to dominate the area, with Fort William specifically being the star-shaped configuration that you're seeing to the lower right, which is also a modification of what we saw in France on a much smaller scale. Another example would be the Writers' Building, 1777. Housed the East India Company, the clerks specifically. Later given monumental porticos and classical symmetry in the facade. Its style is a neoclassical, intends to align with bureaucratic administration with ancient Roman authority. It communicates the centrality of the logistics with colonial power. You're seeing that with this particular building again. And it's an interesting take on a Roman and neoclassical, by the way, because it uses a mansard style with a widow's walk at the top of that, and you would not find either of those traditionally in a proper neoclassical building. St. John's Church, which is 1787, was modeled on St. Martin in the Fields in London. Its style is neoclassical Palladian. It's a little bit of both on that one. Characterized by symmetry, columns, and a pediment. Clear geometric order that symbolizes moral clarity and restraint. Attempts to communicate the moral legitimacy of British rule. And this is Victoria Memorial, which was built 1906 through 1921. It memorialized Queen Victoria was built with white marble. And I'm going to spell it for you guys, because I know it's not up here. Makrana, a very specific marble, and I know that they're looking for that term, which is the same used for the Taj Mahal, and that's why they're looking for the term.
Did you say one more time?
Yep. Makrana. Was that the same? Okay. Its composition is classical with a dome and Mohingo references. Key examples of the Indo-Sardinian style. Yes, I stumble over this. How Professor Lopez and Professor Euros spit these out so cleanly, I don't know. I envy them that. Communicates the idea of Britain as the heir to the Middle Empire. Basically a little cultural appropriation. You know, I mean, there's no other way to put it. Question C. The plantation economies of the British and French colonies in North America and the Caribbean rely on systems of subjugation and control. Explain the main characteristics of these systems with reference to the design histories of enslaved labor, e.g. naval architectures, plantation houses, slave quarters, surveillance structures. And this is a question that you have to use a minimum of 2. So you've got to have at least 2 of the following examples and be able to discuss them and explain them. So you have large tracts of land, number 3 land, under single control. Single large cash crop for export and mass consumption. Usually you're going to see sugar, you would also see tea in different areas. Requires coercive labor plus surveillance plus logistics. Problem being the labor supply. Solution, African slaves. The coffee route. The first act of enslavement that was the capture of people of Africa and their forced march to the coastal ports, which is kind of what you're seeing in here, is related to the design because it functioned as an enforced corridor through the landscape, transforming human beings into transportable property. The coastal slave ports, so the first one is the coffee route. Second one would be the coastal slave ports. And, I'm going to point them out that way so that it makes it easier to kind of look up to once you're out here. This is specialized architecture designed to warehouse goods, contain people, and manage their transformation from human beings into property. By the mid-18th century, surveying architectural plans demonstrates the design of dedicated slave containment cells, and exercise yards, and ventilators for underground prisons, which is part of what you're seeing in this set. And this is another example of coastal slave ports. The naval architecture that they were referencing is the slave ship. Ships used for transportation of enslaved peoples from the coast of Africa to the Americas. The design of the ships, and especially the underground decks, turn velocity into measurable geometry. The brutal forced maritime journey is called the Middle Passage. The most famous example is the Brooks slave ship diagram, which shows bodies packed on 2 decks at a legal capacity of 482 people. Basically, it caps out at 740, and that's what you're seeing in this particular one. The auction architecture converted townhouses. Initially, auctions took place in converted parts of colonial townhouses. This collapses at the boundary between domestic and the carceral prisons architecture shows how the system was integrated into urban respectability rather than confined to distant locations. The Hilbert townhouses in Jamaica is one well-known example. Circulation was engineered to move captives from confinement through a yard for display and sale. And the next one is going to be plantations. A system of fields, workyards, processing facilities, overseer vantage points, and patrol routes. Everything was orchestrated around surveillance and control. Central contradiction and slavers required physical proximity to the enslaved people for daily life, while the system simultaneously demanded hierarchy, fear, and separation. The slave quarters themselves, which were mentioned in the lecture, Spartan self-built minimal dwellings with minimal furnishings and little to no insulation. Plantation economies transformed far beyond the colonies themselves, described one of the changes that these economies brought about in Europe and during the 18th century. The main change was the development of a new European urban culture. Before colonial plantation agriculture, sugar was a rare luxury for elites, coffee, and the assorted was assorted with the Arab world, and cocoa was virtually unknown in Europe. The plantation system made these commodities cheap and abundant. Colonial coffee plantations gave rise to a new institution, the coffee house. The first cafe in Paris opened in 1672. By 1800, there were more than 3,000 coffee houses in England alone. By the mid-18th century, Viennese coffee houses featured glass facades, outdoor tables, and nighttime lighting. This was a new kind of public space. Sweetened tea, coffee, and chocolate created new everyday habits that were pleasurable, addictive, and tied to the identity of being worldly and modern. And since I know all that was a lot, I'm going to stop for a second to see if anybody has any questions, because I know I can write that fast. Yep.
For 2B, we have to kind of say a timeline of what happened. Do you want us to say the actual dates, or do we just be chronological?
I would do it more chronological,
Okay.
because if you can get the dates in, that's better. But go for the broad how and why it works. And if you don't remember the exact date, it's better to be correct in the essence of what you're saying than you get it wrong because you oops on the date. And I don't think he's, from what I read, I don't think he's looking for the exact dates.
Thank you.
And I'm not going to wait an exact date if I can avoid it, if it helps. Any other questions so far? Okay. Howard is.
Can you look at the timeline again?
Oh, yeah. Bear with me, because I don't quite remember where it was either. Okay, that's
Perfect,
true.
thank you.
And my question was for 2E. We had talked about how the economy transformed or changed the architecture. Do we have to talk about how it changed the economy during that time, or do we have to talk about how it changed like the coffee houses having glass facades?
He's looking specifically for the changes and impacts on the economy,
Okay.
and specifically what it did in Europe. The changes in the coffee houses, that would be evidence to support what it did.
Okay.
Because without those changes in the economy, we would not have had the changes in the coffee houses. So it's kind of like one of those reading summary questions of methods and evidence. This is where that stupid question comes back into the real world of when they go to do an exam. Can we go on?
Sorry, there was a slide with text on it. It was the most recent one once you got to where you stopped. And I just need to grab a picture of it.
Let's see. Is it-
No, sorry, I think you passed it. It wasn't a lot of text.
Just let me know where you stopped. I'm not
Right there,
sure.
right there.
This one?
Yep, that's the one I missed. Thank you.
So with question 3, you can already see it's got a lot of parts. The first part, the 2 parts listed below, we pick 2 different interpretations of the Enlightenment principles, describe the key characteristics of each one, explaining how each fits within the Enlightenment debate over aesthetics. The imagery prismed, California Bridget, So the first one, take a photo of, I think, both of these slides that you're gonna see. Debate over the aesthetics, beauty, calm, proportion, harmony, control, the sublime, and vastness, overwhelming emotion, even terror. Debate over taste, enlightenment, view, taste can be cultivated through education. An early romantic view that is innate and natural. These are the debates. I don't know if this image works for some of this. Architectural implications should buildings embody rational beauty or provoke sublime emotional experiences. And with both of these will be on your exam.
Those images?
Pardon?
Those images?
These two images, specifically the one to the right will be on there. I do not believe the one to the left. And this is the Paranisi in Carcisi. So the key characteristics that we're kind of talking about is the etching is part of a series of that depicts enormous labyrinth image. Oh, I see. Okay. So on this image, the one to the left is an etching that is part of a series that depicts the labyrinth imagery of prisons filled with staircases, chains, vaulted arches, and a deep shadow. They're not rational, they're not particularly legible spaces. They are intended to have a psychological effect on their viewer, create a sense of disorientation, oppressive scale. There is no clear order, no exit, no source of governing authority visible. The relationship to the Enlightenment aesthetics for this image belongs firmly to a camp of the sublime rather than the beautiful, where the beautiful was associated with calmness, proportion, harmony, and control. The sublime reference to experiences of vastness, power, overwhelming emotion, rather than presenting antiquity as a stable, rational model to be imitated. This depicts it as a site of melancholy, decay, and fragility, represents an anxiety beneath the Enlightenment's optimism. It is also influenced by the work of Romanticism in the arts, unlike neoclassical architects who sought clarity and moral order. Hanesi mediates on the disillusion of order. Basically, think of this as the first time you ever saw an Escher work, although this is much, much darker. And this set gives you more of the traditional positivity and more of that natural flowing into the landscape. In this one, the Bridget Stowe Gardens is one of several classical architectural qualities distributed through the landscape garden. It served no real function. It was built by people that had a lot of money and could basically waste it. The winding garden paths, irregular lakes, and scattered structures are designed to look natural, and they're not. They are just as set up and just as ordered and created as gardens at Versailles, just in a different way. It is an example of neoclassicism in Europe, which employed classical proportions and symmetrical order driven from ancient Rome. Relationship to the Enlightenment aesthetics, Stowe represents the beautiful end of the aesthetic spectrum, proportional, harmonious, and controlled. It also embodies a neoclassical conviction that architecture should express rational order, moral clarity, and civilized virtue. Stowe also introduces new Enlightenment ideas of the autonomous subject. The visitor does not experience a garden as a passive spectator or a spectacle, as in a Baroque palace, but as an individual who walks through a landscape, forms judgments, and interprets meanings. Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon is one of the most discussed architectural concepts of the Enlightenment. Describe the design and explain how it operates spatially and ideologically. So I know that you went over this a lot. It's a circular prism organized around the central inspection tower. Cells line the outer wing, each one facing inward towards the tower with windows on both the outer wall and the inner wall. The inspector in the central tower can see into every cell at all times. Crucially, the cell occupants cannot see whether the inspector is actually present or watching them at any given moment. Basically, you never know. The key spatial mechanism is the symmetry of visibility. The inspector sees all that is himself as unseen. This is achieved using blinds and backlighting. Cells are visible from dark central tower, while the tower itself remains obscured from the cells. Every prisoner is always visible, yet the source of the surveillance is invisible. The circular forms mean no cell is hidden from the central vantage point, and there are no blind spots. The ideological operation of this, the panopticon operates as a diagram of how centralized power operates during the Enlightenment. It uses rational design principles to shape behavior. The panopticon makes constant surveillance unnecessary in practice because the prisoner never knows whether they're being watched at any given moment. Surveillance becomes internalized, the prisoner disciplines themselves. Power operates not through force, but through architectural visibility. And I'd go ahead and take a shot of this one too, because it'll help you remember some of it. I'm sorry if I could talk any faster, I would. When you compare the Panopticon with Claude Winkle's Royal Salt Works, what do the two designs have in common? What Enlightenment principles does those architecture exemplify? Both organize space radically around the central point of authority. At the Salt Works, the director's house sits at the center of the semicircle with production buildings and worker housing arranged hierarchically around it. At the Panopticon, the inspector's tower sits at the center of a circular solid block. In both cases, the geometry of the plan shows a hierarchy of power. One figure at the center oversees all others. Both use architecture as an instrument of surveillance and social control. In the Salt Works, the entire layout ensures the director can oversee the activities of workers. Like the Panopticon, the plan itself performs governance. Both reflecting the Enlightenment belief that rational design can order human behavior. They are not simply functional buildings. They use geometry and spatial organization to manage labor, enforce discipline, and shape behavior. What Enlightenment principles does this particular structure typify? Rationalism and order. The Salt Works replace the chaotic earlier complex with a rigorously ordered circular plan. Every element is assigned a place according to a rational hierarchy. This reflects the Enlightenment drive to make the world legible and improved through reason. Rodot's central concept is the building should visibly express their functions and purpose. He believed that the form should communicate meaningfully, directly. An example of the entrance columns at the Salt Work that alternate round and square stones to evoke the crystalline formations of salt itself. And you're seeing some of that with this line of the columns themselves. It is representation of the crystallization process. And you see it again with the crystallization or the apparent crystallization as it's coming out of the structure. And most of those images will not, again, be on the exam. The one that I believe will be on the exam is this one. And there is another one, but I don't have it here. There is another one that you will see on the exam, but it will be more of a profile. You will see the large one as well. So you should see this one as well on the exam. Thomas Jefferson's designs at Monticello and the University of Virginia are celebrated as expressions of Enlightenment ideals What do these designs reveal and what do they obscure about the foundational ideas of the United States? So you're gonna see this will be on the exam, as will this image. The other ones on these slides will not be, so just kind of use the others as a reference for yourself. Neoclassicism as a language of Republican virtue. Jefferson, who spent a lot of time in France and studies the buildings of ancient Rome, believed that the classical architecture communicated rational, moral order, civic duty, and governance. By choosing this language for both the private home and public institutions of learning, Jefferson was making a deliberate argument about the character of the new American Republic, and that was a legitimate heir to the Greek democracy and Roman civic architecture grounded in reason rather than a monarchy or aristocratic tradition. And honestly, you could also make a case on this one of its cultural appropriation because he spent time there, and yes, its designs were influenced by ancient Rome and ancient Greece. That is not necessarily part of the English tradition. You know, it's arguable, but they're looking more for the other part. In Monticello, Jefferson integrated mechanical devices, a private library, a skylight dome, and carefully framed views of the Virginia landscape. The building is a portrait of an Enlightenment mind in material form, curious, experimental, self-improving, and in control of its environment. Jefferson's design for the University of Virginia is among the most coherent expressions of Enlightenment architectural thinking. The lawn is organized as a rational hierarchical composition with a central rotunda modeled on the Parthenon of Rome that anchors colonnades descending on either order. Each pavilion uses a different classification, so the buildings themselves constitute a curriculum in architectural history. The design of the University of Virginia reflects Enlightenment's conviction that environment shapes virtue. A beautiful, ordered campus would produce rational, morally serious citizens capable of self-governance. What the designs obscure, the labor that built them. Both Monticello and the University of Virginia were built by enslaved people. This is not incidental. Enslaved labor is the condition that made not only the buildings, but also the operations of the everyday life of these places possible. At Monticello, Jefferson buried the service wing into the hill beneath the house's terraces, hiding them in the classical facades but sightlines. Visitors approached Monticello saw a pristine Palladian villa, seemingly floating above the landscape. They did not see the machinery of concealed labor that sustained it. So you get a lot of these images, you really aren't going to need, but keep in mind this because it shows you a little bit of that layout, and this also shows you the layout for the University of Virginia. And understand how and why they work. This image gives, and I do wish this was on the exam, but it's not, so keep this in the back of your head as well, because this really does go to reminding you that they concealed the labor that allowed these places to run. So it was something that they knew that they were doing. Okay, question 4. There's only a couple more. Define the key attributes of the sublime as stated by authors Ness, Thorpe, and Count. Notice I got red text on this one. Take a photo of this sucker. The highlighted things would be the things I would talk about. That's why I put it bold enough. But you do need to use one from each of these 3 authors. It doesn't really matter which ones you use. So whichever ones you feel most comfortable that you'll be able to remember, and you can make the case that it defines a sublime. So the ones that I kind of recommend, you don't have to use them. There's the strongest emotion which the mind is capable of feeling, implies a sense of wonder or reverential awe. The sublime is identifiable by its repetition and the universality of its effects. Everything on here, though, is a legitimate answer to this question.
On the test, do we need to specify who said it specifically, or just that it?
If you can, that'd be great, because it'll help us not have to take longer on grading this stuff for you. However, if you can't, it's more important that you remember what they said.
Sorry, can you go back to the questions real fast?
Oh, they'll all come back up. I promise. I promise it'll all come back up. But this is one of those outward things, so make sure you hit one of each author. And if you can identify the author, it will help us grade it more accurately and faster for you. So it would help us, not required. We will have access to this slide. And typically when I grade y'all stuff, I pull all this stuff up to help me grade it for you faster. So as long as you're close enough, you're usually good. Okay. What might the most powerful and fundamental source of the sublime be? One word answer, it's nature. And I won't read all this for you because go back in the slides or take a photo of it. Because that's the only answer to that question, nature. Because you have the power that has inspired humanity through countless millennia. And it's nice when it's a one-word answer. The types of sublime. This is pertaining specifically to technology and modernity. Let's see, and it does, I think, answer. Yeah, this is the second part of the B for question 4. All of these are sublime. So you do have effects of quantity, you do have the mathematical, you do have economic. The ones that are most applicable to this particular question for this exam are the geographical sublime, engineering sublime, industrial sublime, infrastructure sublime, and dynamic sublime. If you can remember kind of what it is off to the side, that's even better. Definitely make sure you remember those 5 types because I know he's looking for them. And by the way, those same types are going to help you with should be this image. From the lecture, according to Kant, what might be the most powerful and fundamental source of the sublime using the painting view from Mount Holyoke, Northampton, Massachusetts, after thunderstorm the Oxbow, and utilizing 3 of the terms types of sublime pertaining to the technology. Notice how this is building on the prior question, even though this is a different question. Describe how this source of sublime is represented in this painting by Thomas Cole, and explain how this image connects to the industrial operations of the textile mills in 19th century England. How did industry connect to the plantation? So lots of different parts. So basically you're going to use those examples of the sublime from the prior question to partially help answer this one. And with that, you're going to be seeing things like, I want to go back to my slide. Forgive me while I said I didn't get my slide back. So you're going to be talking about this is going to have the movement through nature. You're going to have the storm. You're going to have the windiness. You're going to have the light in it. Next thing, this is the one where you're going to have the Milltown, and that's where you're going to come into those industrial elements and the industrial elements of the sublime. It's upon these really rivers that the power itself was being extracted. The series were established such that Boston manufacturing and really yelling industry development. Oh, let's see, I want my more succinct notes. Again, I'm looking for more succinct notes for you guys because that's a no. So here, with this one, he's really looking for industrialization. He's looking for the mechanization portions of the sublime as part of those answers. The textile mills and industrial northeastern United States, depending on the cotton being produced in the Agri-American South, and that is basically what we're looking for the tie-in to the plantation system, because it shows how the interconnectivity, there may not have been much of the milling in the South. It was in the north, and that's where those resources were going to. So both northern and southern systems were directly benefiting from it. Sorry, I'm trying to make that succinct and not babble. From the lecture defined one key term, key aspect of industry, and two key aspects of mechanization using the example of the textile mill and early modern factory. How did the industry and mechanization transform our understanding of the functions and organizations of the building? It's another one of the big ones. Look at that highlighted because that's basically gonna probably answer your question. Any of it could partially answer your question, but the most relevant part is both industrialization, revolutions with cause and effect of this age of rationalization, systemization, were sublime in their scale and engagement, challenge with sublime natural forces, and contribute to ever complex systems of socio-political organization, the development of scientific management, the exponential growth of labors, and their organization and expansion, as well as the collapse of earlier forms of human labor and extraction, decline of slavery, emergence of wage worker exploitation. That third one is basically the heart of the answer. So it's a lot of stuff. Do best to get as close to that as a working definition. And if you can't quite remember it all, because I know my memorization is awful. So if you get it through essence of context, you're going to be pretty good, but you've got to be addressing each of the things that we're talking about here. We do or just do it from context. But if you can support that, that's the part I try to remember, the top 2/3. If you can remember that in addition to that bottom one, great. But the bottom one is going to really be the one that you want to try to remember. What is industry? Both of these. Economic activity concerned with the processing of raw materials and their transformation in manufacturing processes within factories into finished goods and commodities. And it's important that we conceive of industry as a social, political, economic relation between the various production activities of the industrial process and the financing legislation power that support it. By the way, these slides are coming right out of the lectures. So it's really exactly what they're looking for. And on this one, it is both things that you're going to try to remember. Again, if you can't remember exactly, try to get it in its context and the intent that it's needed. What is mechanization? From Gideon, movement underlies mechanization. Mechanization supplants the hand. The elimination of complicated handicraft marks the beginning of high mechanization. Mechanization as a phenomenon. The symptom of full mechanization is the assembly line when the entire factory is consolidated into a synchronous organism. Mechanization is the end product of a rationalistic view of the world. Working definition, the active process of introducing machines or other advanced technologies into an industry or other area of activity in order to supplant or entirely supplant human labor. The active process of subordinating the spiritual to the material, the description of things, phenomena solely in the material, and especially mechanical, machine-like terms. A term that implies a process or sequence of processes defined by dynamic, synchronous motion, interconnection, interdependence. All that's a mouthful. Make sure you take a picture of the slide because that is, parts of that in some wording is kind of what he's looking for to answer that particular portion of that question. I've actually tried to boil it down. I mean, that's a Reader's Digest on a cliff note. So I'm making that as succinct as I can for you guys for that one. Because the answer that they have is 2.5 pages long. So that's distilling it down to its essence. Okay, industrial sublime mill towns. Part of that question is that. I'm gonna go back up and see if I can find which part of the question this is. Sorry, I thought I had copied all the questions back down. Okay, so this is the third part of that prior question. So I didn't miscopy it down. The thing that he's specifically looking for that you really want to kind of keep in mind is like, if you're talking about that it can be understood as a vast framework for a mechanized production, that the architecture of the mills of mass industry are not only containing the machines of the industrial production, they are the machines of the industrial production, being fully integrated into the mechanical process of production. And yes, it's a mouthful, but that's distilling it back down to as few words as possible. And the part of the question that is trying to answer, how did the industry and mechanization transform our understanding of the function and organization of a building, is what that red text is trying to specifically address. And then this again shows a mechanism that's part of the machines of production, and that is integral to production. So this image and these two will be on the exam. Again, rely on your images as much as possible to help you jog your memory and answer the question as best you can. And if you reference them, please be clear about which ones you're referencing. And I would definitely encourage you to do that, because I know when I was doing it helped me. And this test, because I pulled my old exams, this is a completely different exam. So, then the next question that he's got, define two attributes of the corporation using the images of large-scale mills, e.g. the Merrimack Corporation Cotton Mill. How did this organization understand the corporation shape the layout and connect individual architectures to modern factories? I'm basically highlighting it here. Right off this class lecture slide for your definition. Corporation, unifying organization usually directed at a group of people, productive bodies, industries, or companies, authorized typically through special charter or state government arrangement to act as a single entity. Ownership, risk can be shared among shareholders or corporate company stock. That's the big part. If you remember anything from the top part, great. You'll thrill Professor Lopez. But it's that bottom part that really goes to the heart of that question. And then you will see this image on the exam. Yeah, so you'll see this one and the next image. The image of the Merrimack Corporation shows a corporate whole as multiple discrete buildings unified by rail infrastructure. Meanwhile, the Blue Cotton Mill shows a fully integrated architecture where the discrete components have merged into a unified complex. And that's what you're seeing with this one. Both of them, all of a sudden the production means is completely vertical. And they're not using the term vertical. You won't find that anywhere, but that's what they're describing. Is when you've got that complete means of production within one controllable architectural format or campus. So that one is actually kind of the easy part of the question. It's much easier than some of the other parts. And that, I'm gonna guess, might be the extra credit question for that particular block. That's what I think. So question 5, define a concept of standardization and standard parts. Describe a key standardized building material of the mid-19th century, how it was made, what structural advantages it had, explain how it was utilized in the following buildings. Describe how modular use of the new standardized material in an infantry building anticipated the emergence of modern skyscraper. So before we go on to that one, I will stop just for a second to make sure nobody has any questions. It's all right. I can barely talk at this point.
Can you go back to the first set of slides?
How about that? Which one? This one? This one? Like I say, if you look at any of these will answer the question, just make sure you get one for each one. Anybody else for now? What is standardization? It's right there for you. Straight from their slides. The quantities of repeatability, interoperability, compatibility, interchangeability, and the part elements or components implied in these existence types. Standardization therefore produces objects that are referred to as standard types. I guarantee you the words in red you want to have exact. And standard types needs to be in the quotations because it may have it, and it will have a different meaning without it being in the quotations. Okay. Cast iron is part of this answer. Iron is naturally occurring mineral found in iron ore, though it often contains impurities in its natural state. High heat and oxygen is required to bring it to a molten state. High heat is generated with combustible substances such as wood, charcoal, and especially coal and coke. The other part below here, it gives you more background, but the top part really is on point for the question that's being asked in this particular case. If you can remember any of the bottom part, great, but my focus would be on those top three. Cast iron structural qualities. Steel relatively brittle, has low tensile strength compared to steel and wrought iron. Not an ideal structural material in cases where it's used in a tension or bending moments. Ideal use of cast iron is in situations of structural compression. Pay attention to the red words. Cast iron relatively brittle, weaker than steel, poor in tension, good in structural compression. That puts those 3 points very, very succinctly. Cast iron structural qualities. By the way, I don't think. Actually, we'll see this slide, this image, and this image on the exam that we're looking at. Okay. Then they're asking a question about how it was utilized, describe the modular use. That's where this set of questions and images start to come into play. They were built out of thousands of standardized cast iron components such as columns, beams, and trusses laid out in repetition, either horizontally and vertically in the case of the Crystal Palace or vertically in the case of the Disney building. So keep in mind, red text. People are going to want to know that.
Can you go back one slide, please? Yeah.
And these show you in the Crystal Palace that you have both vertical and horizontal. These show you that it's predominantly vertical in this one. Question 5E. Define the concept of rent. How does the concept of rent and rentable area, square footage influence the scale, formation, formal organization of housing and business spaces, typologies that contain rentable space? Take a picture of the slide. Rent is a tiered, is tied into a system of commodification of space, whether domestic or commercial, commodifiable and exchangeable units. Represents the maximum allowable possible elevation of rentable units, which can lead to high density construction. Concept of rent lent itself to overcrowding in existing housing stock, as well as a call for housing reform that could lend itself to safer, more hygienic housing types that were also denser and taller. Rent emphasizes maximum rental floor space, and yes, I know it's defining term of the term, and I'm sorry. In commercial buildings, directly responsible in the verticalization of commercial buildings. And yes, I cut it short for that. What is rent? No, the definition of rent should be composed of at least 2 sentences and drawn from at least 2 points. Which 2 you do on this is totally up to you. It's about what is going to be easiest for you to remember and have it tie together and make sense. You want to be as close to the concepts as we're talking about. Don't try to memorize the exact verbiage. Just have the concept more than the verbiage. Just so long as you don't do something that changes and flips the meaning on its head. So keep that in mind. If you change the meaning totally by how you word it, it's going to be a long answer. This isn't the standard slides, but if you do want to take a picture of it, since I don't have the week in the lecture on these slides to tell you where to find them, take a photo of this one but it is in the lectures. This gives you an idea of and examples of the conditions that this created. Question 5C, describe 2 late 19th century technologies innovations that made the modern skyscraper possible. How do new material systems, structures, and zoning laws contribute to the formal and aesthetic evolution of the modern skyscraper. Make sure you take a photo of this one. There's structural steel, material that was used to improve quality of construction, allowing for creation of spiral columns that allow for greater verticality of the structure. Situated to situations of tension, which allow for longer beams and an overall greater span, allow for more vertical forms as well as steel skeleton that had underlying grid. Zoning laws, the big thing about the zoning law in 1916 for New York was the setback, specifically to allow light to penetrate back to the street level so that it wasn't all in shadow. That's boiling it down to the most important part that I know that the professors are looking for this meeting. And with this, you're starting to see verticality because of the steel from Sullivan. And the two modern inventions, the other one is the elevator. So steel is one of them, and the elevator is the other one that you really cannot have an extremely tall building for the time period without those two elements. This also shows the verticality, and it shows how they're starting to stack and to figure out and to discern how to do those step backs to make sure that they have as much space as possible and they're not losing it. And this shows that evolution of form and function. Name and describe 5 components of the modern skyscraper per Sullivan. You just went over all this. This slide gives it to you basically on the first slide. The floor below the ground, below those machineries. Ground floor devoted to storage banks. Second stories, the mezzanines, easily accessible by the stairs. Above this, which is the majority of the building, you're going to have the mezzanine area, the offices, and above that, you're basically going to have the attic that's going to contain additional mechanicals such as water storage. Let me know which one you'd like. Question 6, define two key aspects of urbanization, define 2 key aspects of metropolization. Describe one key example from the lecture, how did modern urbanization and metropolization change the scale and organization of markets and processes similar to food stuff. Do me a favor and take a photo of this one, because I basically pulled it out from the lecture notes. Focuses on the force of metropolization, creates new centralized markets and highly infrastructured processing centers as parallel to highly infrastructuralized interconnectivity of metropolises. Classical metropolitan capitalism tended to be built around the centralized production of new processing facilities. Venture capitalism that trade union yards of Chicago serves as a place in which surplus commodities in rural locations, in this case livestock, can be aggregated, sold, and sent to processing. A key factor in industrial relations and commodity manufacturing, processing, and distribution is that each architectural component of the ensemble is integrated into the system of infrastructure. Okay, what is urbanization? 2 clear components from each of these definitions. It doesn't really matter which one, so long as they make sense and you can argue the point and make sure that you remember it. And again, in context, more so for the exact word. Closer you get the exact word, great, but it's more important that you understand how and why. And what parts of those make it work. Same thing for metropolization. And you notice I tried to give you a little bit of that, a little bit more succinctly right off the bat as opposed to just the slide of the definitions to make it a little bit easier.
Could you go back to the urbanization rules? Yeah.
No.
No.
That way.
Yeah, there you go. Thank you.
And I would definitely take again a snapshot of this one. I know that they're in the normal slides, however, and then if it were me, I would find the 2 that were a little simpler and they're a little shorter. because that's gonna be a little bit easier to remember, and then really focus on the context and as much of the verbiage as you can. You've got the context right, you're gonna go a lot farther with it. Question 6 has 2 different parts. Part 1, what it is for the perceived negative, 6D. What is the perceived negative effects of modern urbanization and metropolization? Negative effects include congestion, overcrowding, pollution, dangers of industrial work, speculative leaks. You don't have to have all these, but have a bunch of them. Because this is one part of the thing, you can almost partially list part of that answer, so just give it a halfway sentence structure. Part 2, what urban social reforms in the 19th century were envisioned with the creation of the modern urban park, such as Olmsted Central Park in New York. The park was a place of engineered natural landscape and it continued to provide respite from industrial urban life. That it was a place for leisure, social gathering, and the mixing of different peoples and classes. That the park form and placed upon the urban landscape was an intentional break from a critique of the urban fabric, aimed socially at speculation and dense construction. Notice I didn't talk about the health benefits that actually come from it, but that is another one of them. But I know that those are kind of what he's hearing for it now, and that makes it a little bit more digestible than the other ones. And you see that partially with the stockyards, with the organization. You see it again with in contrast, the Central Park image where every approach has been designed to begin to push you to see what they want you to see at any one time. And in this case, at that time when it was originally created, it minimized your ability to see the city itself surrounding it. And with this, you're going to see basically the organizational layout and the break of the grid system, but you see elements of the grid system, like right here, 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 and here, where you can still see those elements crossing the park and having some interconnectivity. And then you can still see it here, but from a longer longitude, you don't see it as much. Question 6C, part 1. Looking at Frederick Olmsted Central Park in New York and Prospect Park in Brooklyn, how did the system of vision pass aesthetic plantings, architectural interventions, and public art frame the landscape instead of social interactions? Different paths, pedestrian paths, pleasure carriage drives, urban traffic. There are different levels, and they keep the paths of that circulation segregated by type. So you don't have necessarily somebody on foot or riding horseback crossing a carriage with each other. So you have a little more of an enjoyable environment and you don't have that risk of applying to something. The architectural interventions such as the archways and terraces and planting interventions contributed to experiences of procession, meander, compression, and expansion. Paths and interventions contributed to social interventions of spectacle, exhibition, and spectatorship. And it does do each of those things. I know that that's kind of what they're looking for the answers for that part 1. And you may not remember exactly all those words, but try to be as close to the concepts as possible. Part 2, what did these structured social interactions reveal about the 19th century working class relations and reformist attitudes? Have to name at least 2. Right, before you have to name 2, this one you have to have at least 2. That the social interactions of spectacle, exhibition, and spectatorship were tied to the formation of new conceptualizations of class consciousness or class aspirations. Basically, it's a form of elitism, is another way you can put that. And spectacle and spectatorship was tied to being seen and seeing others. It would be a very succinct way to put that. Try to be a little closer to this other verbiage. But so long as you can explain the concept that it's to be seen and to see, and that it's to create a sense of higher social standing, which is kind of the principle behind it, you're probably going to be just fine in that question. That second one would be that they were reflective of growing urban consumerism manifested in fashion, for example, which is part of that being seen they were showing on fashion and affluence. That the society experience revealed a classism, even amongst progressive reformers, since the park experience was seen as an environment of embetterment and social modeling the new behavioral norms, that many of these goals were particularly directed towards the working classes and the newly arrived immigrants. I don't think, did he mention the park in New York that was also done by Olmsted, where to this day you actually have to have a key to get access to the park?
He
That-
mentioned it, but they didn't give access. They didn't give much information about it. He just mentioned it.
Okay. I mentioned it just to reinforce the difference of that social elitism, that classism. Central Park didn't have that requirement, where the other Olmsted Park does. So even in a park like Salem, you can have that differentiation. That's just a contrast to help kind of reset it in your mind that even though this was meant for the general public and everybody could access Central Park, you still have those elements of the society for elitism and that segregation, just not as locked out. And it actually gave them more of an opportunity to show off their wealth because they could do it in front of pretty much everybody. Question D. How did the design and engineering of the modern urban park establish new disciplines of expertise management and change the way that urban regional infrastructures and experiences were conceived of aesthetically and environmentally through the 19th and early 20th century? We need to address and discuss at least three. The urban park. Where is the park? What's the type of that? The urban park was developed into the parkway. The union of parks and parkways developed into the idea of the urban system of parks. Some urban systems of parks, such as the Emerald Necklace and the Fins in Boston, were conceived as ecological systems in the case of water management. Emerald Necklace think Olmsted. The urban system of parks and parkways developed along the transportational routes, and that together these made possible the modern development of modern suburbs. Finally, the systematic organization of parks and parkways and transportation routes were eventually conceived of at a regional scale, and that this gave birth to modern regional planning. And you see that regional planning basically in the commons park system. You also see it in this particular image of Planet Chicago with the radio coming out of the old downtown core along central axes going to large parkland areas and adjacent wetlands. I think that's the last of the slides. So any questions? So